Welcome to the Master Your Millions podcast, the show all about your financial potential and leaving a legacy for future generations. Here are your hosts, Jason and Scott Henderson.
We are very excited for our special guest today. Jason, who do we have coming on?
Today's guest is Jennifer Novak. She comes to us through a mutual friend, if you will, that's been introduced. She's been introduced to, and we're happy to have her on the podcast today. She's an LA native, was born and raised there, and then went away to Northern California, went a long, long ways away, Northern California to Berkeley, and then to UC Davis. Is a wife and a mother of two, I believe, grown children. That she is an attorney. And one of her specialties is in environmental law. And the cool thing that we're going to discuss today is how going from generation to generation and passing on businesses and ideas sometimes can be problematic. And she helps kind of guide people through that maze, if you will. So welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Appreciate it.
Oh, to start off a little bit, tell us how that you came into environmental law. I know that you always wanted to be an attorney growing up. What was it that drew you into environmental law?
Well, it was actually a bit of a happy accident. I was interested in environmental issues, but from more of a practical standpoint. I studied both geography and land use planning in college. But I wanted to be a lawyer just to help people. And it wasn't until about 5 years into my legal career that an opportunity came up to go work for the California Department of Justice in their natural resources section. And that's basically the outside law firm for most of California's natural resources agencies, who are the ones imposing all these regulations on businesses and people and trying to balance keeping everyone safe and protecting the environment with the very real practicalities of needing an economy and needing businesses, and the fact that we use products that use chemicals and metals and things of that nature. So after 10 years at the Department of Justice, learning all about how environmental regulations are made and how to balance them, I ended up in the private sector again, where I founded my own law firm, and we focus solely on environmental issues, primarily helping property owners and businesses navigate this world. And we've been at it for almost 11 years now.
So go ahead, Scott.
I was going to say, for a lot of our listeners, and even myself, give us some examples of what you do, because that's like way out in right field compared to what we do every single day. So what's a typical day look like, and what are some typical cases you take on?
Sure. Well, let me take a step back and say I realize that for many people, they don't feel like environmental law impacts their daily lives. But if you really think about it, there's very few things you do in the course of your day that are not guided by an environmental law. The quality of the air you breathe, the quality of the water you drink, what kind of materials can go into the clothing you're wearing or the furniture that you have in your home, whether you could put a school right by, a refinery. All of those things are guided by environmental laws. And of course, in California, we're a little more rigorous about this than in other places. On a typical day, we can represent, for example, terminals at ports that can't pick up and move to Texas, for example. They have emissions they have to worry about. They have oil and other products that can go into the water and affect our aquatic environments. We have clients who are wineries because that is technically an industrial process, and they have rules about how they can handle their materials and whether they're going to go into the water. We have clients who invest in properties out in places like the far-flung desert that then get a letter in the mail telling them that they're being accused of being criminals and having hurt the environment because a drug cartel was illegally growing marijuana on their property without their knowledge. Those are all examples of people that we help. And it can also get down to things like, father-son, two-person transmission repair businesses that send their used oil off to recyclers like you're supposed to do. and then find out that if that recycler mishandled it and has caused massive contamination, everyone else in that stream of commerce is now a polluter as well. So a lot of it is demystifying and what environmental laws are, and a lot of it is helping people who are good people. It's just the way our system is designed. Unfortunately, they can find that there are consequences for just engaging in business or just owning certain types of property.
So give us probably the top 3 issues that you see when it comes to passing, because I mean, our podcast is all about accumulating wealth, enjoying wealth, and passing it on. And it sounded, what we said earlier, you said something about how I'm the dad and I started a business and this is how I do it. And now I'm getting old. I'm not, but I'm getting old.
Hypothetically.
Not hypothetically.
Yes.
Watch it, young man. I'm getting old and I want to pass my business on to the next generation, say to Scott. And he's coming up and things are different. What are some type 3 problems or issues that you see kind of in a generic way that business owners need to be thinking about?
Sure. I mean, the first is that often families are lumping all of their assets together into a trust, or they just hold them. And when it passes on to the next generation, no one has segregated out potentially problematic assets. So if, for example, you had a business that in the past had created some level of pollution at a property, the fact that now time has passed or there may be new owners doesn't matter in terms of your legal liability. If you had segregated that piece of property or that business from the rest of your assets, then
So
you
give
can
us some examples. Maybe
Okay.
it's an auto mechanic that changes oil, or what's
Sure.
an example? Something that
you say you owned property and you leased it to a dry cleaner back in the 50s, 60s, 70s when they were using
Okay.
her, right? And now, I mean, we do have a client who's in this situation. She's the trustee of a family trust, and they're having problems deciding whether they can release assets from the trust to the beneficiaries, because they're going to be responsible for cleaning up contamination that has now been found at their property. They didn't cause it. They were just the people who rented to the dry cleaner. But as the property owners, that is their problem. And because that dry cleaning property is one of many assets that they hold, all of their assets are potentially at risk to pay for the contamination that was caused at that site. So that's one example.
Okay, why are they all at risk?
Because the question is whether or not the trust itself or whoever holds that asset has the money to pay for it. I mean, if you're balancing these questions from a societal standpoint, we have an interest generally in not letting pollution exist and put our drinking water at risk, put our oceans at risk, hurting people's health if they're breathing in fumes. So the general rule is that if someone can pay to clean it up, they're going to be held responsible to clean it up. And even if it was just the one asset, if it's commingled with everything else, then the question isn't, well, what was that asset worth? It is, does this family, does this trust have the ability to pay for the problems that it caused?
So how should they have segregated it?
Often people are putting properties into a separate LLC. If you have a business, incorporate it. And then we're really looking at the assets of that corporation. If you have corporations, honor the fact that there are formalities you have to follow in order to maintain that they are totally separate from everything else you have going on.
And like corporate resolutions, annual shareholders meeting,
Correct.
that type of thing.
Exactly.
Okay. So even though it's owned inside of a trust, the trust can own the LLC. What you're saying that they should have created a separate LLC to hold this property versus other LLC inside the trust owning this. Does that make it enough of a separation?
It can. What you don't want is for the trust to be the owner and then to be able to trace it back. So ultimately, you've got to look at that whole chain of ownership and then decide whether or not somebody is just hiding something, or whether we truly can say it is separate from everything else. So that is one area that
Okay,
we
so
see a
that's one
lot of.
example.
Yeah, we get a lot of calls from people who have inherited commercial properties, and it turns out someone in the past may have caused harm to it. Another example is when we have a business that can that were subject to environmental regulations, and maybe something was missed, or maybe there was just an accident, and now the business itself may be something that isn't going to be a retirement plan for the family. It's going to be something that they have to address because they're accused of having created a bigger problem. And that could be, for example, chrome platers, gas stations. Those are just some of the ones we see most commonly, but it doesn't have to be heavy industrial. It could be, like I said, commercial properties as well. We represent people who are developers, and in the course of creating an apartment building or something of that nature, they're also subject to things. And so the asset that you're looking at may now actually owe money you didn't budget for because you didn't consider the potential environmental liabilities or costs.
I feel like you should have written a book about this. Have you done so?
I have not, no. But for me, I do videos that I put on YouTube. I love to come on podcasts like this because I'm very much about educating people. And I think I said it earlier, we tend to be judgmental when we think about the environment and pollution, but the reality is that the way the laws are set up, the definition of polluter is actually really broad. And many people who would never in a million years classify themselves as being bad people or polluters, just from a legal standpoint, that's what they become. And it's a real shock to them to learn that even though they thought that they were doing everything correctly, it's a strict liability situation. And in the law, that just means it doesn't matter what your intent was. It doesn't matter if you made a mistake. We're only looking at the end result, and that's what makes you responsible.
So playing a little bit of devil's advocate, I'm not trying to cause contention here, but say we've got a property that I bought this year.
Yes.
And someone polluted on it 100 years ago, then I get accused for that. It's my liability.
It can be, yes.
What's the justification behind that? Seeing as I'm not even born 100 years ago. Jason was, but I wasn't. But like, what is the justification behind that law? Because for a lot of people new to this, they come in and they're like, that's ridiculous. There's no way that I should be held liable. We should go back in the records and track down who it was.
Well, let me separate out two different concepts. The first is what I just discussed, is this issue of strict liability. So you bought the property, you own whatever's on it. You own the structure, you own the contamination, you own the proximity to goods, schools, and shops, and what have you. So the easiest way for us to look at how we're going to clean up a mess is to look at who currently is in the best position to do something about it. And unfortunately, the easiest person to find is the person who owns it now. And that's why, taking a little sidetrack, a lot of people have trouble getting financing because the banks are more and more in tune to the fact that they don't want to lend on a property that may have these legal liabilities, where if it's foreclosed, now the bank owns the problem. And so that's why they'll require environmental assessments. And that's why people are recommended to get environmental assessments of their own before buying a property. So that's one part of it. The second is that, of course, if you're the person who just bought the property, you have no connection to anything in the past, you do have the right to drag those people in. But the way that the law is set up, that then falls on you to bring them in and try to force them to be held accountable for what happened in the past. And going back, Jason, to your question about, like dad or grandpa or whomever, what do we want them to know before we start moving down into the other generations? Well, we want everybody to keep their records from all of that. And I see lots of people who are moving their family members into assisted living, or a family member dies and everybody clears out, the warehouse or the garage. They're throwing away gold because in those pieces of paper are documents that say whether or not you used the chemicals in this business or at this property that are now being found in the ground. There are things that talk about whether there were insurance policies back in the day that might cover any harm that's found here. There might be names of tenants. I have a lot of clients who don't even know who the tenants were who were on their property 20, 40 years ago. And so all of these things can help provide you that defense. And then, Scott, to your point, if it turns out to have been somebody 50 years ago, 100 years ago, maybe now you have that information where you can either A, offer it up to the government and say, hey, how about you check out these guys instead? Or B, if someone's going to drag you into a lawsuit or some sort of administrative action, you can demonstrate that these are the people who really should be held responsible.
Is it always the government that goes in and is the accuser, or is it usually someone that raises a white flag or a red flag and says these guys are being irresponsible?
I see it both ways. And so here's an example. Let's say you own a piece of property in a business park and you want to sell it. And like I just said, the bank is going to want to look at what kind of investment they're about to make. A lot of times in the course of that environmental assessment, they're going to say, wait a second, we're just an office building. Why are we coming up with petroleum products or dry cleaning fluids or, some sort of chemical that is used in munitions? And then they're going to look around and say, well, where could this have come from? And sometimes you'll find out that your own property had a history you weren't aware of, but more often you're going to look around and realize, oh, it's the next door neighbor, or it's a property down the street. And now we know that that property is the problem. That's how it can come to attention. Occasionally, the government may just look around and say, well, we know dry cleaners are a problem historically. So now let's go look at all the dry cleaning sites that we can to see whether or not they're a problem. But generally, the government doesn't have that kind of resource. So it's the private parties then who are looking to say, well, it's not my fault. My property is contaminated. You, Mr. Neighbor, caused it. And now what are you going to do about it?
Let's see. So what is there any regulation in place for me just going down the street and saying, oh, you're at fault, not having any idea whatsoever, but just causing problems? Or is there a certain process? Because from the other people that I've talked to, it sounds like that it's pretty easy to accuse someone, almost like you're not innocent before. You have to prove your innocence rather than prove that they're guilty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely makes sense. And it really is a topsy-turvy world, even for lawyers who aren't environmental lawyers. It's confusing to them, the fact that this system is built up to prove your innocence. And you are, in effect, guilty until you can prove that. Let's separate out the government versus a private party. So if I'm just a guy buying a business and I think you've caused, and I accuse you of having created a problem, in that circumstance, if I'm going to sue you or I'm threatening you, I still have to prove a direct connection between you and what I think the problem is. There is still a level of proof there. What often happens is the government suspects or has some information to suspect that, okay, well, maybe you've caused a problem. And then they start this little, for lack of a better word, game. They'll first ask you for information. What do you know about the place where you work or the place where you're located? And again, we're not just limited to industrial and commercial. This can affect residences too. So it'll be some information gathering. And then it might be we'd like you to sample. We have some information that suggests this property may be subject to, some sort of environmental contamination. We would like you to hire a consultant and do some sampling. And then at each stage, you're asking, am I clear now? Have I demonstrated there's no problem here? And you can get yourself out from under it, but you've, in the meantime, had to pay a significant amount of money. And that's what burns people quite a bit, is that, wait a second, why are you coming after me? And usually it doesn't come out of nowhere. Usually the situation is they go, oh, well, we know that there was once a, fill in the blank business that traditionally pollutes. on this property at some point in time, or you handled certain chemicals at this property at some point in time. Therefore, we want to check that you didn't cause a problem. And that's how that's kind of the reasonable basis that they will give to start asking for that information.
Okay. So you essentially could self-incriminate through this question and answer, this cat and mouse game.
Yes, I mean it is. There's a level of science. You know,
Mhm.
if you go digging around in the soil at your property and you come up with chemicals, where do those chemicals come from, right? But it can also be that it's really not a problem you've caused. It's someone else is infecting your property, for lack of a better word, and you can make that demonstration. But if businesses haven't planned for this possibility, if they don't know it's a possibility, then it's a real shock to suddenly be told, oh, and by the way, this could cost you 10, 20, $50,000 just for you to get to the place where the government says, okay, you're good now.
So the government doesn't pay for it. It comes out
Oh,
of
no,
your direct pocket and you have no choice in the matter.
correct. And here's something that's very scary, which is often people are being told this in a letter on government letterhead. And so it doesn't look like a lawsuit. It doesn't look like something any more important than any other, form letter you might receive. But usually at the end, they're going to give you a deadline and they're going to tell you if you don't comply, you could be subject to penalties. And that's your tip off that this is actually a very serious matter. And you should, at the very least, go talk to a consultant, go talk to a lawyer, and find out more about that situation. The first question I often get is whether this is some sort of scam. And that's true whether or not it's a letter from the government or a letter from an environmental group or a letter from the next door neighbor. A lot of people are thinking, well, wait a second, this doesn't look legitimate to me. And so I have to go through that educational process to explain, okay, here's what it means. And sometimes they're overreaching, so we can pull them back. But yes, very often you're going to have some level of response, or you completely lose the right to complain about it later.
Okay. So, I mean, it just seems like law is up on its head. It's upside down from what everything else. Well, why is it that way? Why is it not more of innocent until proven guilty, or some of these other things where the government has a little bit of responsibility, where if they accuse someone wrongly, they have to foot the bill. Like that seems outrageous.
Well, at some point in our history, decisions were made about where we wanted to put our emphasis and our priorities. And having worked for the government, and I swear there were times where we were not allowed to use pens. We couldn't get pens and paper out of the supply room because the budget was preventing my department from even buying supplies. I get the fact that if we only relied on the government to expend its resources to find out who's causing problems, we wouldn't be catching a lot of situations. And there might be perfectly innocent people. For example, you own an apartment building and there are fumes coming from the gas station next door that could hurt the people in your building. Well, you need a recourse. Can you imagine then if now the government had to go and find, actual proof that 50 years ago this gas station caused the problem that, is now in your apartment building? Sometimes, yes, they have to, and sometimes we want to make it as easy for the government as possible to protect people who are truly innocent in that situation.
So it's not uncommon that most people will hold individual properties in individual LLCs to protect them from liability from property to property to property. So you don't
Correct.
pull it in there. So what you started off with is saying that, and even in this situation, so if someone goes into, say, purchasing a new asset, whether that's a property, whether that's an apartment complex, whether that's a business, whatever, that as part of the due diligence, and then I'm hearing you correctly, you're highly recommending that they do an environmental study.
Correct.
Now, let's say the environmental study comes back and say, yeah, you seem to be good. One of the things that has changed over the years is our ability to detect chemicals.
Correct.
It used to be parts per 100, and then it was parts per 1,000, then it's parts per million, and we're starting to be in the parts per billion. and this level of danger is changing, well, you have a certification that you have, the environmental study says it's good. And you go into there and you can prove with, and you've done good in having your corporate resolutions, your annual things, and showing this has been our business, which we've been, maybe it's even like you said, apartment complex. You inspect the apartments, there's not anything going on there. And then the law changes, right? It completely changes. And now with that new threshold, there's a problem. Or is there some sort of grandfathering clause that would allow you to escape some of that madness?
I'm going to give you the lawyer answer of it depends. But first of all, what you pointed out is that would actually be really good news, which is somebody who's truly done their due diligence, and not even to the level of going into the individual apartments and seeing if there's a problem, but hiring a reputable consultant, looking honestly and seriously at what the property is like, what its history was, and getting the conclusion in a report from the consultant that we've decided there does not appear to be a risk here. That can be used as a defense.
So is that part of a regular inspection, or is it something you're talking about a consultant, someone who's a specialist
And
in environmental
a
issues?
geologist is generally one of the people who's going to come in and look at it. But there are, I don't know, not dozens, maybe hundreds of companies that handle environmental consulting issues. And most of them can handle this type of work to do that assessment. And if you have that level of due diligence, then we have what we call bona fide prospective purchasers. We have we have things where you can show that it's not like you bought a property that you knew had problems or could have problems, and you agreed to buy it and take on that responsibility anyway. So that can be a shield in terms of your responsibility. And in those situations, then your obligation is more along the lines of, okay, well, if they need your cooperation, if they need to come onto your property to do testing, if they need you to answer questions, you'll agree to help them, but now it's not all on you. The problem, Jason, is that many people get into these transactions and they're so eager to take advantage of a deal, or they think it looks good, or they don't want to spend the $5,000 to $10,000 to do an environmental assessment. And then they just leap into the situation, and sooner or later they will deal with the consequences.
Well,
or whoever they sell it to later will deal with the consequences.
is that really what we're talking, is $5,000 to $10,000 to do an assessment? I mean, if you have
It can be,
a duplex that's worth 120,000, you're talking about a 10% increase in the investments of what you're putting there. I mean, all of a sudden it's not going to cash flow. It's not going to be worth anything. Right.
Well, then,
but you do that. I guess that's a risk you take.
well, I'm not suggesting that everybody do it. I mean, we didn't do it when we bought our house, for example. You can ask yourself some questions in that type of scenario to ask yourself, how are you going to weigh whether this is a good risk or whether I should invest the money? So obviously, an industrial property, commercial properties that may have had a gas station or a dry cleaner or something on it that could cause problems. If you're located near an airport, if you're located near an industrial area, I mean, those kinds of places, you generally are going to be thinking you might want to know what you're getting into. You can also go to some of the government websites and enter an address, and the property you're looking at might not appear. That doesn't mean there's no problems. It just means it's not on the government's radar. But you certainly can look around who your neighbors are going to be to see if, across the street was a gas station with a leaking underground storage tank. Wonder what the status of that is now and whether or not a problem was ever detected on my property. So you might not always need to do that assessment, but just be cautious. And certainly, I've seen people who have invested in properties and they have not asked the questions or they've just assumed everything will be okay. Like, Scott, in your scenario, I didn't cause this, right? I'm fine now. There's no dry cleaner here now. That doesn't mean you're 100% out of the woods. I hope that was helpful. I mean, so again,
No, it's just scary.
Yeah.
Now we don't want to do anything. We're just
Oh, it's
feel
100% scary. I give this talk. I gave this talk once, and somebody approached me afterward. He said, "I used to own a whole bunch of gas stations. Like, this is really frightening to me." And I said, "Well, we'll see what happens, right? It doesn't mean that necessarily someone's going to come after you, but there are obviously ways in which you can try to protect yourself. We talked about segregating assets. Another way might be to purchase insurance. Your general liability insurance is not going to cover it. Environmental insurance is available, though expensive, but it can save people's bacon if they need it. Another option is getting financial assurances from whoever is in the transaction. There are indemnity provisions that can be put in that are good to a point. They can also fail if whoever agreed to indemnify you doesn't have any assets or is no longer around. And sometimes, I mean, there are definitely people out there who, once they discover there might be a risk that they'll be cleaning up a property, they'll bargain down to like nickels on the dollar and say, look, if I'm going to have to clean this up, I'm not paying you full price. And there are plenty of people who will sell it to you at a discount simply because they don't want that problem anymore. There's also state money or federal money that can be available in certain circumstances. So again, if you don't know these questions to ask, how are you going to arm yourself with understanding whether or not this is a good deal or bad deal?
deja vu. The Scott says it seemed like you should have written a book, and that's what I feeling like this too. That's something you put out there.
Well, maybe you've inspired me.
Landmines of the investing in different properties from an environmental point of view, or something like that.
Right. And on the whole, I'm a very positive person. I love solving problems for people. I tell people I'm not certain how I ended up in this field because a lot of time it does feel very doom and gloom and scary. But my hope is that if people know what questions to ask, know how to gauge their assets, their investments, their actions, it's not going to be doom and gloom for everybody. And some of the people could catch problems before they become more difficult to deal with down the road. It's just as humans, we have this tendency to not want to know the bad news and to always assume it's going to be the worst possible news, so we won't confront it.
So that's what you would suggest, is just let's confront it now. Let's get the scary skeleton out of the closet and at
Yep.
least know what it is.
Absolutely. And a lot of times it's not all that scary.
Well,
But
and also the being proactive and thinking your way through and segregating assets. I mean, that's a very simple thing, right?
absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
mean, that's probably the biggest gem of this whole episode is those that have assets, and you segregate them out, period.
Right.
Right? You have do you have any feel? So this is a question. Do you have any feel how series LLCs work? Would that be segregation enough, or does it be completely? You understand what a series LLC is, right? Because
I do.
That's one way, and not every state has accepted them as valid, but that is a different way of segregating properties, right, into a separate LLC, not then needing a completely separate IRS filing for taxes. If I understood it right, do you have any feel
Right.
there with how those work in this situation?
So there's the correct answer, and then there's the strategic answer. From a correct standpoint, again, you're looking at who owns what to ultimately get to the true owner. So my feeling is you're not going to fully protect yourself unless it is a completely different entity, like you said, taxable, technically different corporate structure than anything else. And I have had clients, property LLC number 1, property LLC number 2, and that's how they hold various properties, which is a pain in the butt, let's be honest. However, from a strategic standpoint, when someone comes knocking on your door and says, hey, your property is causing a problem for me, and that's whether it's the government or a private entity, how hard is it going to be for them to figure out what you're truly worth and therefore what you can dedicate to this problem? That's the strategic question. And I will say that the government doesn't scare easily, but they also like the path of least resistance. So, a whole bunch of hoops to go through, might get them to turn their attention to an easier target temporarily. That doesn't mean you can completely get out of this, but it does mean that, maybe at some point they decide to go after the current property owner, or to, or to negotiate with you to see what they can get. Again, it's not bulletproof, but my advice would be keep that completely 100% separate.
So then do you need to go to the extent of having a Wyoming LLC or a Delaware corporation to get even more anonymity? Is that make the path less resistant?
That's a great question, because we just wrote about the Corporate Transparency Act kicking in this year, where all the LLCs, regardless of where they are going to have to fess up as to who the true owners are, and through a chain as well. That information is currently going to be held by the federal government, but I could very easily see a situation where states want that information too. So I'm not certain that at the end of the day, putting it in a Wyoming LLC gives you any more protection than a California LLC, for example. You still want it to be its own thing. And certainly we have clients who don't put my name on anything. I don't want to be a witness to something, but at some point in time, even the LLC might need a representative, and then you're kind of out of the hiding. But if you have that corporate structure and you've maintained it and it's legally its own entity, that gives you some protection.
Awesome. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for
You're
coming
welcome.
on.
Always happy to tell people something about my world and to get more people thinking about what they can do to protect themselves and their families.
Well, definitely a subject that I had never really thought of, but it's something that those that are listening to us and hopefully giving us good reviews and things, and wanting to build their wealth, amass their millions, as we talk about, this is something they need to have on their radar.
Right. And if they already have real estate attorneys, business attorneys, trust attorneys, easy enough for them to take care of this problem. They just need to know that there might be a problem first.
Right. And of course, we want to put maybe your website or something at the bottom in case someone wants a specialist such as yourself in the environmental law space. We will be putting that in the show notes.
Appreciate that, because like I said, too often people didn't take the actions that they needed to in the past. And then I'm the one who's got the legal mess to clean up.
And then Jennifer, when that book publishes, you can come back on the show.
Absolutely. And autograph
send us
copies
a copy
to everybody.
first. Sign copy first. We get number one.
I will absolutely come back and do that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Jennifer. Guys, if you'd like to connect with Jason or I, please hit us up on our social media platform. Take your pick. You can always find us. Also, if you want to connect with Jennifer, her links will be in the show notes down below. And if you would leave a 5-star review for us, that would be extremely helpful. Last, remember, mastering your millions all starts with your mind and your team. Make sure they are the best. Catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Millions with Jason and Scott Henderson. Check the show notes for any links or contact information about today's guest. Make sure to follow the show so you don't miss any future episodes.